The bag sat on my counter for 11 minutes before anyone said a word about it. I remember because I was watching the clock above the stove, the one with the chipped black rim, and I remember thinking that 11 minutes was not very long at all for a life to start tilting sideways. I was 23. I had been married 4 years. I had walked to the dry goods store that morning because our usual flour was out, and the woman behind the counter, an English woman, new to the store, kind in the distracted way English people are kind, had handed me a different bag without asking, because it was the only unbleached flour left on the shelf. I did not think about it again until my mother-in-law walked into my kitchen that afternoon, looked at the counter the way you might look at a snake sunning itself on your porch step, and went very still. "That is not your flour," she said. I told her the store was out. I told her it was still flour, still white, still going to become bread by supper. I did not understand yet that I had just handed the district something to talk about for a week. I did not understand that by Sunday, women 3 farms over would know the brand, know the color of the bag, know that I had not walked the extra mile to the mill that carried what my husband's family had always used. I did not understand yet that in my community, the smallest domestic choices were never really about flour. My name is Naomi. This is the Amish Wife, the channel where hidden Amish wife stories are told from the inside, not by outsiders looking in, but by women who lived it and found their way out. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. I married at 19. I left at 26. If you are new here, welcome. If you have been with me for other stories, thank you for coming back. These are not easy stories to tell, and I tell them slowly, the way I learned to tell the truth at all, which is to say sideways, and only when I trust the room. Before I go further, I want to ask you something, because I always want to know who is listening. Have you ever had someone in your life turn a small, ordinary choice, what you cooked, what you wore, what brand you bought, into a referendum on your character? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one of them, even the short ones, even the ones that are just a sentence. Now let me tell you about the flour. To understand why a bag of flour could undo a week of my life, you have to understand what held my community together, and it was not the church rules that were written down anywhere, because almost none of them were. We had the Ordnung, the unwritten code, the thing that lived in the air of a district the way humidity lives in August, invisible until you tried to breathe against it. Nobody handed you a pamphlet. You learned it the way you learned to walk, by falling against its edges until your body remembered where they were. The hierarchy was simple, and it was never spoken as hierarchy. It was spoken as order, as if order were a kindness. God, then the bishop, then the husband, then the wife, then the children. Gelassenheit, yielding, surrendering the self so fully that the self stopped being a thing you defended, was the highest virtue a woman could hold. And Hochmut, pride, was the sin that could unravel it. Pride did not require boasting. Pride could be a woman who bought a different flower without asking. Pride could be a woman who thought her Tuesday afternoon belonged to her. In the outside world, buying groceries is just buying groceries. In my community, buying groceries was a small, quiet performance of who you had agreed to become when you knelt for baptism, and the entire district was, in its own gentle way, always watching to see if you were still performing the part correctly. Everyone knew this. No one said it. It does not have an official name in Amish life. The watching, the noticing, the slow moral audit of a wife's daily choices. But it exists the way many things in Amish life exist, fully, constantly, and without a word. My husband's name was Jonas. We met the way most of us met, at a Sunday singing in a barn strung with lanterns, when I was 17 and he was 20, and neither of us had said more than a dozen words to each other before his sister arranged for us to walk out together after. He was not loud. He did not court me with declarations. He drove me home in his open buggy under a sky so clear I could still find the exact stretch of road in my memory, and he told me about his horses, and I decided, the way girls in my world decided things, that this quiet was safety. We married on a Thursday in late October. Around 300 guests. 4 hours of preaching before either of us said a word to each other in front of anyone. Roast chicken, creamed celery, 7 kinds of pie laid out on tables built specifically for weddings and taken apart again after. My mother cried the good kind of crying, the kind that is allowed. I want to be careful here because this is not a story about a monster. Jonas was not cruel. He never raised a hand to me. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside, handed the same script I was handed, and neither of us had ever been given the tools to imagine another way of being married. Our first daughter, Ruth, was born 11 months after the wedding. I loved her the way you love a small warm animal that depends on you for everything, entirely and without reservation, and I told myself that this, the baby, the bread, the quiet, was the whole of a good life, because no one had ever shown me another shape a life could take. So there I was, 4 years married, one small daughter asleep in the other room, a bag of the wrong flour on my counter, and my mother-in-law's face gone the particular still that I would come to recognize as the look women in my world wore right before delivering a warning disguised as an observation. "The Millers carry the right kind," she said. "It is not far out of your way." I said the store was out. I said it again, more slowly, the way you repeat something to a person who seems to be waiting for a different answer. She nodded, but her hands had already stopped moving over the dish towel she was folding, and in my world, hands that stop moving are their own kind of sentence. She left without finishing her coffee. That was the first tear. By that evening, Jonas came in from the barn quieter than usual. Not cold, not sharp, just quiet in a way that had a texture to it, a quiet with weight in it, the kind you could feel pressing against the kitchen the way a change in barometric pressure presses against your ears before a storm you cannot yet see. He ate his supper. He thanked me for it. He did not ask about the flour, and somehow the not asking was louder than any question could have been. I lay beside him that night listening to him breathe and understood, without either of us saying anything, that something had shifted in the room, and that I had caused it, and that I did not entirely understand how. I want you to understand something about how discipline worked in my world, because it is almost never what people from the outside imagine. There was no shouting. There was no slammed door. What there was, instead, was a controlled and total withdrawal of warmth, administered by an entire community with a precision that still amazes me when I think back on it now, from the distance of years and a therapist's office and a language I did not have then. The second morning, my sister-in-law Susanna stopped by with a basket of eggs I had not asked for, and she talked to me about her children's teeth, her garden, the weather coming in from the west, and never once mentioned the flour, but she also never once looked directly at me while she spoke, and when she left she said, "You'll want to be careful this week, Naomi," and did not explain what she meant, and did not need to. By the third day, the bishop's wife arrived unannounced with a loaf of her own bread, still warm, wrapped in a checked cloth, and sat at my table and asked after Ruth, and asked after Jonas's mother's arthritis, and asked, in the gentlest voice I have ever heard deployed as a weapon, whether I had been finding the adjustment to married life harder than I expected lately. I said no. She smiled at me the way you smile at a child who has just told you an obvious lie, patted my hand, and left the bread on the table like evidence of her own kindness, which of course it was. That was the whole design of it. The kindness was real. The kindness was also the mechanism. I did not understand that yet. I would understand it a week later. On the fourth night, something strange happened. Jonas came home early from the Yoder's barn raising, brought a jar of the chow-chow I favored, and was tender with me in a way he had not been in months, teasing Ruth until she laughed so hard she hiccuped, telling me over supper that I worked too hard and should rest more. I remember lying awake that night feeling almost dizzy with relief, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing, if the cold I had felt pressing into the kitchen for 3 days had been nothing but my own tired mind making shapes out of nothing. That was the last kind evening for nearly 2 weeks. I would come to recognize this pattern so many times over the following years that eventually I stopped being surprised by it, though I never stopped hoping, every single time, that the warmth might simply stay. My friend Rebecca, who lived 2 farms down and had married the same autumn I had, came to help me with canning that week, and it was over the tomatoes, hands slick with juice and seeds, both of us working in the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable between women who trust each other, that she finally said what everyone else had been circling. "It was never about the flour," she said, not looking up from the tomatoes in front of her. "You know that." I asked her what she meant. "It's about whether you asked," she said. "It's about whether you decided something on your own, without checking first whether it was allowed." She glanced toward the window, toward the lane, as though checking who might be walking up it. "They don't care what brand you buy, Naomi. They care that you thought you were allowed to choose." I sat with that for a long moment, my hands going still in the bowl of tomatoes, feeling something in my chest reorganize itself around the shape of what she'd said. Rebecca had always been the friend who said the things out loud that the rest of us only felt. "Has this happened to you?" I asked her. She did not answer right away. She reached for another tomato, turned it over once in her palm, and said so quietly I almost missed it. "It happens to all of us. The flower is never really the flower. By the end of the first week, the bishop himself came, not unannounced this time, but with the kind of advance notice that is its own form of pressure, because it gives you days to sit with dread before the actual conversation arrives. He was tall, gray-bearded, and he had never once in my hearing raised his voice, which was somehow more frightening than if he had. He sat in our front room with a cup of coffee I had made too strong out of nervous hands, and a slice of pie sat untouched on the windowsill where my mother-in-law had placed it before he arrived, as though pie were a form of diplomatic ceremony. He talked at first about the harvest, about a barn that needed a new roof, about nothing at all, and I understood that this was also part of the design, the slow approach, the warmth laid down first so that whatever came next would feel less like an attack and more like concern. "We do not want to lose you, Naomi," he said finally, and I remember how strange that phrase felt in my mouth, even though he was the one who said it, because I had not gone anywhere. I had bought flour. "A wife who makes her own decisions in small things," he continued, "sometimes finds it easier to make her own decisions in large things. We want to help you before that happens." I said I understood. I did not fully, not yet. But I had learned, the way every woman in my world learned, that the correct answer to a bishop's gentle warning was always agreement, regardless of what was happening underneath your ribs while you gave it. Before I keep going, if this story is resonating with you in any way, if you've ever had a small choice turned into a test of your loyalty to a system you didn't fully choose, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel and hit like, because these stories reach more people when you do, and reaching people is the whole reason I tell them. If you have stayed with me this long, thank you. It is not easy to hand these memories back over, even now, even from the distance I have now. Let's keep going, because the flower was only the beginning of what that autumn would teach me. There was an older woman in our district named Lydia, a widow, well past 70, whose hands had gone soft with age, but never slowed with their work. She was at the quilting bee that gathered the following week, the kind of gathering where a dozen women sit around a frame passing needle and thread and gossip in the same unbroken rhythm. And I found myself seated beside her, both of us working a corner of the pattern in silence. She did not look at me when she finally spoke. Her eyes stayed on her needle, her hands never stopped their small, even stitches, and her voice was so low that I had to lean toward her to catch all of it. "They do not hit us," she said. "That is not our way. What they do is harder." I asked her what she meant. "They take away the warmth," she said, still not looking up. "A little at a time, until you cannot remember what it felt like to have it, and then they give a little of it back, just enough, and you spend the rest of your days grateful for scraps of something that used to be whole." She tied off her thread. "I lost one at the end, you know, a daughter, not to death, to leaving. I did not understand until years later that I had taught her, without meaning to, that this was simply what a woman's life looked like." She patted my hand once, the way you'd reassure a child, and turned back to the quilt as though she had said nothing more remarkable than a comment on the weather. I sat there with her words settling into me like stones dropped one at a time into still water, and I understood for the first time that I was not the first woman this had happened to, and I would not be the last, and that understanding cracked something open in me that would not close again. It was Rebecca again, a few days later, who told me what had happened to Lydia's daughter, the one Lydia had mentioned so briefly at the quilting frame. She had left, decades ago, after a long, slow year of exactly this kind of pressure over exactly this kind of nothing. A borrowed book, if Rebecca remembered right, or maybe it was a hat, the details had blurred with time, and she had never come back, not even for her own mother's eventual funeral, because by then the shunning had become permanent in a way that outlasted even death. "Everyone knows the story," Rebecca said. "No one tells it whole. You only ever get it in pieces, the way I'm giving it to you now." I thought of the years my own mother had lived inside this same structure, and a colder thought arrived beside it, that my mother had likely faced her own version of a flour bag once, some small early test that had taught her exactly how much of herself she was permitted to keep. I had never once heard her tell a story like that. I understood, sitting with Rebecca's kitchen clock ticking behind us, that her silence had not meant nothing had happened to her. It had meant the system had worked on her exactly as well as it was now working on me. I went to see my mother the following Sunday, ostensibly to bring Ruth for a visit, and found myself instead asking her carefully whether she remembered anything like this happening to her when she was young and newly married. She did not answer right away. Her hands, shelling peas into a bowl on her lap, kept their rhythm, but something in her face went still in the same way Jonas's mother's face had gone still over the flour. There was a dress, she said finally. A color I liked, that your grandmother did not. It went on for most of a winter. She looked up at me then, and there was something in her eyes I had never seen before, something that looked almost like an apology that could not fully form itself into words. I thought if I taught you the rules well enough, you would never have to learn them the hard way, the way I did. I understood in that moment, sitting across from my own mother with her peas and her careful hands, that she had not simply failed to warn me. She had believed with her whole heart that her silence was a form of protection. That understanding did not make me angry at her. It made the whole shape of the system clearer to me than it had ever been. Because if my mother, who loved me, had submitted so completely that she could not even name what had happened to her, then this was not a flaw in a few unkind people. This was the entire architecture working exactly as it had been built to work. I want to be honest with you about something. Understanding a system is not the same as being ready to leave it. For nearly 2 more years after that conversation with my mother, I stayed, and told myself all the reasons that staying made sense. Ruth was young, then Ruth had a baby brother, then winter roads were bad, then my father's health was failing and I could not add to his worry, then the church would take my children from me if I ever tried, then. Every reason was real, none of them in the end was the true reason. The true reason was that leaving meant becoming a stranger to everyone I had ever loved, and I was not yet willing to pay that price, even once I understood exactly what price I was already paying by staying. The moment that finally moved me did not look like a moment at all. It was an ordinary Tuesday in March, hanging laundry in a hard, cold wind, and I looked down the line at Jonas's shirts. 6 of them, evenly spaced, dripping. And understood, in the plain, unremarkable way you understand that a season has finally turned, that I could not do this for another 30 years. Not because of any single cruelty. Because of the accumulated weight of every small permission I had learned to ask for, every bag of flour I had learned to fear buying, every warm room that had turned out to hold a warning inside it. I will not tell the whole of that story today because it belongs to a different video and it deserves more room than I can give it here. I will tell you that it took 1 more year of quiet preparation, hidden egg money folded into the lining of an old coat, a Mennonite woman in town who had helped others before me and asked no questions she didn't need to ask, 1 single suitcase packed slowly over many weeks so that nothing would look different in my closet on any given day. I will tell you that I left with my children on a morning I had chosen carefully, and that I will save the rest of it for when I am ready to tell it whole. The shunning was exactly as total as Lydia had told me it would be, all those years earlier at the quilting frame. Letters I sent came back unopened. Phone calls I made to my parents' shanty rang into a silence that somehow felt louder than any voice could have been. My father, the one time I saw him afterward, in town, by chance, looked through me as though I had become something made of glass, something he could see past but not into. My sisters crossed the street when they saw me coming, not out of hatred, I have come to understand, but out of a fear so total it had reorganized their whole understanding of what love was allowed to look like. Even now, years into my life outside, there are small aftershocks that surface at the strangest moments. I still sometimes find myself hesitating before I buy something small for myself, a habit of asking permission that has no one left to ask. I still flinch, faintly, when a phone rings unexpectedly. I once apologized to an English cashier for taking too long deciding between 2 nearly identical bags of flour, and stood there afterward in the parking lot, keys in my hand, laughing and crying at the same time at what my body had just done without asking my mind's permission first. I found a therapist 2 years after I left, a small, patient English woman with reading glasses she was always misplacing, and a windowsill lined with plants that somehow all survived despite her constant distraction. It was in her office that I first heard the words for what had happened to me, words my community had never given me because giving me the words would have given me the power to name what was being done. She called it coercive control. She told me that consent, given only because the cost of refusing has been made unbearable, is not really consent at all, it only wears the shape of it. She told me that emotional withdrawal, administered by an entire community with patience and precision, is still punishment, even when no one raises a hand or a voice. She said something to me once that I have never forgotten. The most effective systems of control are the ones that feel exactly like love. And she said, on a different day, looking at me over her glasses with the kind of directness I had never once experienced from anyone in my old life, a community that cannot hold your questions does not actually trust its own answers. I want to be careful here, the way I have tried to be careful throughout this story. I do not hate the Amish. My husband was not a monster. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside, handed the same script, taught the same fears, and I do not believe he ever understood, any more than I initially did, what the system he was enforcing actually cost the people inside it. The system is the thing, not the people caught inside it, doing what they were taught, believing it was love the whole time they administered it. And I want to say, too, that the community gave me things I still carry gratefully. A work ethic that has served me my whole life, a faith in something larger than myself that I have rebuilt in my own shape since leaving, sisters in spirit if not in blood, women like Rebecca and like Lydia, who told me the truth sideways when they could not tell it any other way. I do not throw all of it away, I only refuse to pretend that the good excuse the rest. If you grew up in a place where your smallest choices were treated as referendums on your loyalty, I see you. If you ever bought the wrong thing, said the wrong word, wanted the wrong small ordinary thing for yourself, and felt an entire room of people you loved go quiet and cold around you for it, I see you. If you were ever taught that being good meant making yourself so small and so agreeable that there was nothing left of you to refuse with, I see you. You were not being difficult. You were not being proud. You were surviving inside a system that was built carefully and gently and completely to make sure you could never say no without paying a price for it. The framework was the mistake. Not you. It was never you. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you most. Tell me your own story, if you're ready to share even a piece of it. I read every single one, and I mean that. Subscribe to The Amish Wife if you haven't already, because there is so much more I have not yet said, and these stories only reach the people who need them when you help carry them forward. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life. Your no is a whole sentence. It always was.